That structure on the water is now the property of this association. And frankly, Mr. Vance, you should be grateful we are handling the sale instead of the sheriff. That was Diane Keller, president of the Cedar Hollow Owners Association for 11 years running, standing on my own dock in white sneakers that had never seen a wet board, telling me she had just auctioned my lake house out from under me. She was holding a clipboard and a printed flyer with my home on it. Behind her, idling on the gravel, was a black SUV with a vanity plate that read Pres DK. My late wife built the planters on that porch with her own hands. My daughter learned to swim off the end of that dock. And Diane had sold all of it, at a closed auction nobody told me about, to her own cousin for a number that would not cover the cost of the windows. What Diane did not know, what she had never once bothered to check in 11 years of pointing her finger at my fence line, was that I spent 31 years as the county recorder of deeds. I retired the same year she got elected. I have read more title chains than she has read emails. And the lake house she thought she had just sold was sitting on a parcel that was never legally inside her association at all. I had the paper to prove it. I had filed it myself, years before she ever owned a clipboard. So let me ask you something, the way I would ask a neighbor leaning on the same fence. If a woman in clean white sneakers stood on the dock you built with your wife and told you she had already sold your home to her cousin and she had a sheriff on the way to back her up, what would you do? Would you shout? Would you call a lawyer and start bleeding money by the hour? Or would you go inside, pour a cup of coffee, and open the folder you had been keeping for 6 years? Stay with me. I want to show you exactly which one I did. My name is Harlan Vance. I am 63 years old. For 31 years, I sat behind a counter at the county recorder's office and stamped, indexed, and filed every deed, easement, lien, and plat that crossed 300 square miles of mountain and lakefront. I know how land gets described. I know how it gets misdescribed. I know how a careless surveyor in 1974 can put a property line in the wrong place, and how that error can ride along, copied from document to document, for 50 years until somebody who actually reads the words notices it. People think a recorder's office is a dusty room full of paper. It is not. It is the memory of a place. Every fight over a fence, every inheritance, every loan, every divorce that touched a piece of ground left its mark on those shelves. And I was the man who filed the mark and could find it again 20 years later in under a minute. I did not love the job the way you love a hobby. I loved it the way you love a thing you are good at, the way a carpenter loves a square corner. The lake house sits on 4.5 acres at the north end of Cedar Hollow, on the only stretch of true deep water shoreline in the whole development. The rest of the lake there shelves out, shallow and weedy, good for cattails and not much else. The north end, though, drops off fast, dark and cold and deep enough to dive. And that is where my grandfather built. He bought that land in 1961 with money he saved running a feed store. And he sank the cedar pilings for the dock himself in waders in October, because that was the only month the water was low enough. The deed he signed predates the association by 22 years. I have held that deed in my own hands more times than I can count. The ink has gone brown. The legal description on it is written in the long, careful hand of a county clerk who has been dead for 40 years, and every word of it is precise. My wife Carol and I moved into the house full-time after I retired. She had cancer by then, though we did not know how little time we had. We thought we had years. We had 14 months. She spent her good mornings on that porch with her coffee and her seed catalogs, planning beds she would not live to plant, circling varieties of climbing rows in pen and reading the descriptions out loud to me while I pretended to do the crossword. She built the planters along the porch rail herself, out of cedar offcuts from the same trees, measuring and cutting and screwing them together, over 3 weekends because she did not trust me to get the proportions right. She was correct not to trust me. They are still there. I water them. She made me promise her one thing near the end, when the morphine had taken most of the rest of her words. She said, "Do not let them have the water, Harlan." She had watched the association creep north along the shore for a decade, swallowing easements and access strips and a little public boat ramp that used to be free. And she knew what they wanted, even before I did. She had a sharper nose for a land grab than I did, and I was the one who indexed them for a living. I promised her. I held her hand, and I promised her. And it was not a vague comfort the dying promise. It was a contract. And I meant to perform on it. Then I went and did the only thing I've ever really known how to do. After the funeral, when the casserole stopped coming and the house went quiet, I pulled the chain of title on my own property, and I read every word of every instrument in it, back to 1961, the way I would have read it for a stranger who paid the search fee. My daughter Maddie was 15 when her mother died. She's 17 now. She is the reason I get up in the morning and the reason I did not let the quiet of that house swallow me. She is also, it turns out, a better evidence clerk than half the people I worked with for 3 decades. She has her mother's eye for when something is off. She is the one who started photographing the notices the day they began appearing on our gate, framing each one with the date showing on her phone, and she is the one who said, "Dad, you should put all this in one place, you of all people." So I did. I drove into town and then bought a single accordion folder, brown, with a cloth clasp that ties. I labeled each pocket by year. Every notice, every letter, every photograph, every receipt went into it the same day it arrived, never the next day, always the same day. Dated in pencil in the corner in my own hand. I treated it the way I used to treat the public record, with the boring, relentless care that nobody notices until the day it is the only thing standing between a family and the loss of everything they have. Because that is exactly what it was about to become. The first notice came on a Tuesday in spring, 2 years after Carol passed. It was taped to my gate in a clear plastic sleeve, the kind you slide a sheet of paper into, and it had been stapled at the top so the rain would not get in. Somebody had taken care with it. A violation notice from the Cedar Hollow Owners Association, citing my dock for being out of compliance with community aesthetic standards, with a fine of $200 and a demand that I remove the dock within 30 days. My dock. The dock my grandfather sank cedar pilings for, in waders, in October. I stood at the gate and read it twice in the cold morning air, and I felt the old heat come up the back of my neck. The heat that wants you to drive straight to somebody's office and put the paper on their desk and ask them what in the world they think they are doing. I did not do that. I walked back up the gravel to the house, slow, and I poured a cup of coffee, and I let the heat go out of my neck while it cooled. Then I dated the notice in pencil, and I filed it in the folder under that year. Incident number 1. After that, I drove the 18 miles into town to the office I used to run. And I asked the young woman at the counter, a clerk I had hired myself before I left, to pull the recorded plat of Cedar Hollow, the one the developer filed in 1983 when the association was formed. She brought it out and laid it on the counter and said, "You doing okay out there, Mr. Vance?" And I said I was about to find out. I had stamped 1,000 documents like that plat. I knew exactly what I was looking for and exactly where on the page to look for it. And there it was, in the legal description, plain as a fence post. The association boundary ran to the high water contour on the south and east shores. My grandfather's 4.5 acres at the north end were carved out by mites and bounds. named specifically as excluded, reserved to the original grantor and his heirs in perpetuity. That was me. I was the heir. The developer who built the whole association had, with his own surveyor and his own attorney, drawn a line around my family's land and written the word accepted next to it, and then recorded that fact in the permanent public record where it had sat for 41 years. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for the whole rest of this. I did not run to Diane Keller and wave that plat in her face. I did not even call her. I have watched 100 property fights in my life from behind that counter, and the ones who lose are almost always the ones who show their hand early and loud. The ones who think being right out loud is the same as winning. It is not. The record does not shout. The record waits. It does not get tired. It does not get emotional. It does not need to be believed, because it simply is. So I made a certified copy of the 1983 plat, and I made a certified copy of my grandfather's 1961 deed, and I paid the search and certification fees like any member of the public. And I put both certified copies in the folder, and I said nothing to anyone. I paid the $200 fine under written protest, with a one-line letter stating that payment was not an admission of jurisdiction and reserved all rights. I kept a copy of the letter. Then I waited to see what Diane Keller would do next, because I already knew that a person who sends a fine like that does not stop at one. What she did next, that fall, was send an inspector. He arrived on a Thursday morning at 8:45. A soft-handed man in a salmon-colored polo shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his belt that said "Compliance" on it in block letters, and nothing else. No agency, no number, no seal. I have made a lot of official identification in my life, and I know what a real one looks like. This was not one. He came up onto my porch without knocking, clipboard already out. And he told me he was there to perform a mandatory interior inspection of my home for code adherence, and that he would need access to all rooms, including the basement and the attic. I asked him which code. He said the community code. I asked him which statute or ordinance authorized a homeowners association to inspect the interior of a private residence, because in 31 years of recording property instruments, I had never once seen such an authority exist. He could not name one. He shuffled the clipboard and said it was in the bylaws. I told him calmly, with my hands in my pockets, so he could see they were nowhere near him, that the bylaws of an association do not apply to a parcel that is not in the association, and that this parcel was not in the association, and that he was therefore standing on private land with no more authority than the mailman and considerably less courtesy. I asked him to step back off my porch. Behind him, I could see Maddie at the kitchen window with her phone up, filming the whole exchange the way we had agreed she would whenever anyone came up the drive. The man looked at the window and looked at me, and decided the morning was not going the way Diane had told him it would. He left, his rental sedan through gravel backing out. That photograph, the laminated badge, and the polo shirt, and the plate number on the rental went into the folder that same afternoon. Incident number 2. I wrote one line beside it. Claimed authority to inspect interior. Could cite no statute. Departed when challenged. Now here is the thing I started to understand that winter, and it changed how I read everything that came after. Diane Keller did not actually care about my dock or my paint or the inside of my house. I had been treating the campaign as if it were about aesthetics, as if she truly lay awake, bothered by the silver of weathered cedar. People like me, people who keep records, have a bad habit of assuming everyone else is also operating on the surface of the stated reason. They are not. Diane Keller's husband, Greg, ran a development company out of an office park 2 towns over. I knew this the way I knew everything, by pulling records. because a curious man with a courthouse card and 31 years of habit does not stop pulling records just because he retired. On a slow afternoon, I ran Greg Keller's name through the grantor-grantee index and the planning files, the way I would have run anyone's, and what came back stopped me where I sat. Greg Keller had filed preliminary plans with the county planning office for a 40-unit luxury development called Cedar Hollow Point. I pulled the site plan. Every single one of those 40 units was drawn to face deep water, with private boat slips sketched along a frontage that did not yet legally exist. And there is only one stretch of deep water in all of Cedar Hollow. It is the 4.5 acres at the north end where the lake drops off fast and cold. It was mine. It had been my grandfather's and my mother's, and now it was mine. And Greg Keller had drawn 40 luxury units and their boat slips on top of it as if it were already his. The fines, the inspector, the looming threat. None of it was about a dock railing or a coat of paint. It was a campaign to make staying so expensive and so exhausting that an aging widower would finally throw up his hands and sell the only land that made an 8-figure development possible. The overreach had a price tag, and the price tag had a lot of zeros behind it. That is the part I want you to remember when your own gate gets a notice taped to it. The clipboard is rarely about the clipboard. The fine is rarely about the fine. Follow the money, pull the planning files, find out who profits if you leave, and you will usually find a reason sitting there that has nothing whatsoever to do with your paint. I went back to filing. But now I filed with a purpose and a cold clarity I had not had before. Because I understood at last that I was not collecting complaints from a busybody. I was building the evidentiary record of a scheme. The escalation came in steps, and I counted every one, because counting is what turns a nuisance into a pattern, and a pattern into evidence a judge can hold in her hand. In the spring of the next year, the fines started arriving monthly, then weekly, each on the same association letterhead with the same printed signature block. $200 for the dock. $300 for a fence that exceeded height limits, a fence my grandfather had built and my father had repaired, and I had restained the summer Carol got sick. $500 for a so-called unpermitted structure, which was the tool shed, which had stood in the same spot since the Johnson administration. $250 for quote-unquote unapproved exterior modifications, which turned out to mean Carol's cedar planters. They fined me for my dead wife's planters. By midsummer, the association ledger they mailed me claimed I owed $4,100, and the cover letter warned that unpaid amounts would become a lien on the property. I paid none of it after that first protested $200, and each refusal went into the folder with a dated letter restating, in the same flat sentence every time, that the parcel was not subject to the association's jurisdiction and that no lien could attach. The documented incident count, by the end of that summer, stood at 9. Then they came for my neighbors, which is the move that tells you a board has stopped pretending it is about rules. There is a couple 2 parcels south of me, the Reyeses, retired school teachers, the kind of good, steady people who actually were inside the association and paid their dues and went to the meetings. Diane sent them a letter and copied it to several other households, implying that my non-compliance was dragging down everyone's property values and that responsible neighbors should encourage me to sell and move along. Thomas Reyes brought it to me himself on a Saturday, embarrassed, holding it out at arm's length like it had a smell to it. He said, "Harlan, I do not believe a single word of this, and Elena does not either. But I thought a man has a right to see what is being mailed about him behind his back." I thanked him, and I asked if I could keep the letter. He said, "Take it. Take all of it." And he handed me a second copy that had gone to the Pruitts. Both went into the folder. Incident 10 and 11, the kind that show coordination. that show a campaign and not a complaint. And Thomas said something to me on his way down the porch steps that I wrote down word for word that same night, so I would not lose it. He stopped with his hand on the rail Carol built, and he looked out at the water, and he said, "You know what gets me about that woman, Harlan? In all these years, she has never once knocked on a door to ask a question. She only ever shows up to deliver a verdict." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. It is the whole portrait of her in 2 lines. She did not investigate. She did not inquire. She did not read. She announced. And a person who only announces, who never once checks, is a person walking toward a cliff in the dark, certain the ground will hold because it always has. A sheriff's deputy came that fall. His name was Ray Whitfield, and I had known Ray a little from my courthouse years. Enough to nod to in the hall, enough to know he was straight. He came up the drive slow, parked well back, and got out with his hat already in his hand, which told me a good deal about him before he said a word. He came because Diane had filed a complaint that I was operating an illegal short-term rental out of the lake house, renting rooms to strangers, running a business in a residential zone. I had never rented a thing in my life. Ray stood at the bottom of the porch steps and apologized before he even started, which is not a thing crooked men do. He said, "Harlan, you know how this works better than I do. You sat on the other end of it for 30 years. A complaint gets filed. We have to roll on it. We have to come out and look. The merit of the thing comes later. The rollout is not us taking a side." I told him I understood completely that I had logged 1,000 complaints exactly like it across my career and watched most of them evaporate the moment somebody checked a fact. He looked relieved that he was not going to have to fight me about it. Then Ray gave me the single most useful sentence anybody handed me in the entire fight. And he gave it to me leaning on the gatepost like a neighbor and not a deputy. He said, "Look, here is the truth of it. Right now, this is her word against yours, and her word comes on official-looking letterhead, and yours comes off a porch. And that is not a fight you win on a single afternoon, no matter how right you are. Now, if you can document a pattern, a real one, dates and times and incidents, the kind a judge can count on her fingers, then it stops being he said, she said, and turns into something the county can actually act on. Get yourself to 12 documented incidents, clean ones, dated, with photos, and bring the whole thing to me." I told him I was already at 11. He pushed his hat back and whistled low and said, "Then you keep right on going, Harlan, and you write down every single thing, the date, the time, who and what. Because the day you cross that line is the day this becomes my problem to solve instead of yours." So the folder became a countdown. Every notice taped to the gate was no longer just an insult to swallow. It was a number, a step on a staircase, getting me closer to the threshold Ray had named. And there is something steadying about turning fear into arithmetic. Maddie made a chart on the inside of the folder's front flap. "We are at 11, she would say, taping a photograph into the 11th pocket and ticking the chart. "We are at 12. The association office would call the house with another threat, another deadline, another invented fee. And instead of my stomach dropping the way it used to, I would reach for a pen, and Maddie would reach for her phone, and we would log it together at the kitchen table. And somehow the two of us turned the worst 2 years of our lives into a quiet shared project. I am not sure she knows how much that saved me. The day the chart hit 12 was the day Diane Keller crossed the first real line, the one that turned a civil nuisance into a crime. I had driven into town for a box of deck screws and a gallon of stain, an ordinary Wednesday errand, and I came back up my own road to find a crew of 3 men in the act of welding a length of heavy steel bar across my gate. Not the association's gate. There is no association gate up there. My gate, the one at the foot of my own drive, on my grandfather's deeded land. The gate Maddie painted green the summer she turned 16. They had a portable welding rig running off a generator, and a shower of orange sparks was falling onto my gravel. A foreman in a reflective vest walked over to my truck and handed me a work order on Cedar Hollow Owners Association letterhead, signed by Diane, authorizing the closure of the access drive to parcel 004, pending resolution of outstanding violations. They had bolt cutters lying in the grass where they had already cut my chain, and they were welding me out of my own home, with Maddie's bicycle still leaning against the porch on the inside. Maddie was in the passenger seat beside me. She did not cry, and she did not shout. She lifted her phone, steady as a tripod, and she started filming the welder and the sparks and the work order in the foreman's hand. And she said very quietly, just loud enough for me to hear, "Dad, I have got the whole thing, every second of it. Keep him talking." 17 years old, I will tell you. I have never been prouder of another human being than I was in that truck. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand how hard that was, because my hands were shaking on the wheel, and there was a sound in my ears like water. And every cell in my body wanted to get out of that truck and put a stop to it with my hands. And hands lose these fights. Hands are exactly what a board prays you will use, because a man who shoves a welder is a man they can file a complaint against. So I sat still, and I took out my phone, and I called Ray Whitfield directly at the number he had written on the back of his card. I told him, flat and clear so the recording would have it clean, that there was a crew committing criminal trespass and destruction of property on a deeded parcel that was not within the association, that they had already cut my chain, that they were welding my gate shut with my child locked out of her home, and that I had all of it on video. Ray said, "Do not touch them. Do not touch the gate. Stay in your truck. I am coming." He was there in 20 minutes with his light bar going. He read the work order. He walked over and looked at the fresh welds and the cut chain and the bolt cutters in the grass. The foreman said the association president had authorized the closure, said it twice, as if the word president were a key that opened any lock. Ray said, "The association president does not own this gate, and she does not own this drive. And unless one of you can put a signed court order in my hand in the next 60 seconds, this welding stops right now, and these tools go back on the truck." Nobody had a court order. There was no court order, because no court had been anywhere near it. The rig went quiet. The men packed up under Ray's eye, and they left. That night, the video went on to 2 separate drives. One I kept in the house, and one I drove to the bank and locked in a safe deposit box I rented the next morning specifically to hold it. Because evidence that exists in only one place is evidence somebody can make disappear. Incident number 12 was the one with teeth, and I knew it the moment the sparks stopped falling. The lawsuit landed 3 weeks later, delivered by a process server who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. The association sued me for $41,000 in accumulated fines and interest, and it sought a court order forcing the sale of my property to satisfy a lien they claimed had attached. It was a thick filing, a good half-inch of paper, full of the kind of confident, sweeping language that lawyers bill by the hour to produce, the kind designed to make an ordinary person's stomach fall through the floor. I read every page of it twice at the kitchen table while Maddie did her homework across from me, and somewhere on page 4 I stopped, and I read a sentence a third time, and I put the paper down, and I will admit my heart was going hard. Because here is where Diane Keller made the mistake that people like Diane Keller always, eventually make. In the body of the complaint, in plain black and white, signed and verified by her own attorney under his bar number, the association asserted that parcel 004 was, and I am quoting the filing exactly, functionally and historically part of the Cedar Hollow Association and subject to its full jurisdiction and authority. There it was. She had finally, in a sworn court document with her lawyer's name on it, committed herself in writing to the one position in the entire world that she could not defend. For 2 years, she had said it on porches and in letters, where words evaporate. Now she had said it to a judge, on the record, where words are kept. She had put the whole weight of her case down on a board that I knew was rotten clean through. Because I was the man who had recorded the true grain of that board 30 and 60 years before she ever bought a clipboard. I did not feel triumphant reading it. I felt the way you feel when you watch someone step confidently onto ice you happen to know is thin. I still did not show my hand. My lawyer, a quiet older man named Foster, who I had hired precisely because he did not like to grandstand and did not charge me for theater, asked me plainly why I wanted to wait, why we did not simply attach the deed and the plat to our answer and end it in a week. I told him the reveal only works once, and it works best when the other side has fully committed and stopped looking for it. If we showed the paper now, I said, she would quietly drop the suit, walk away, regroup, and come at the land again next year through some other door. I did not want her to retreat. I wanted her on the record, all the way in, with the auction and the lien and the sworn jurisdiction all hanging on a hook I controlled. Foster looked at me for a while, and then he said, "You really did do this for 30 years, didn't you?" We filed a simple answer denying jurisdiction, conceding nothing and explaining nothing. And we let the case roll toward a hearing. Through all of it, the fines kept coming, and the letters kept coming. And into the folder they went, dated, everyone. By the week of the hearing, the documented incident count stood at 19. Then, 8 days before the hearing, while the lawsuit was still pending and unresolved in front of a sitting judge, Diane Keller held the auction. That is the part that still stuns me when I lie awake. The pure arrogance of it. The certainty that the ground would hold because it always had. She did not wait for the court she herself had invoked. She posted a notice of foreclosure sale that, by every law I spent 3 decades enforcing, should have been published in the newspaper for weeks and served on me personally, and was instead taped to my gate in one of those plastic sleeves and mailed to a post office box I had closed 6 years before. She held the auction on a Wednesday morning in the association clubhouse, with the blinds drawn. There was, by the clerk's own later count, exactly 1 bidder in the room. His name was Lonnie Keller. He was Diane's first cousin. And he bought my home, my wife's porch and her cedar planters, my daughter's dock, my grandfather's deep water, for $62,000. A number that would not have covered the cost of the windows. When the county later pulled the deed she tried to record from that sale, it listed Greg Keller's development company as the line holder of record and the source of Lonnie's purchase money. They had auctioned my family's land to themselves, cousin to cousin, with the husband's company holding the paper, to feed Greg's 40 units. And they had done it in a drawn blind clubhouse, while a judge still held the case in her hands. Which brings us back to the dock, and the white sneakers, and the flyer with my house on it. Diane came to deliver the verdict in person, the way Tomas said she always did. She stood there glowing with it. And I did exactly what I told you I did. I said, "Diane, I think you should hold off on telling your cousin to measure for curtains." Then I went inside, and I came back out with the folder, and I drove to the county building, because the place to win this was not on my dock. It was at the recorder's counter where I had worked for 31 years, in front of the one neutral authority whose stamp Diane Keller had never once thought to check. The hearing was the following Tuesday, in a small wood-paneled courtroom I had walked past 1,000 times in my working life. The Rayetses sat in the back row. Ray Whitfield stood along the side wall in uniform, off the clock, there on his own time. Maddie sat beside me in the second row in the navy dress she had worn to her mother's funeral, because she said it was the only thing she owned that felt serious enough. The association's attorney spoke first, smooth and certain, walking the judge through the ledger of fines, the lien, the completed foreclosure sale, asking the court to ratify all of it and order me removed from the property. Diane sat at the table beside him in a cream blazer with her chin up and a small private smile, the smile of a woman who has already measured the curtains. When it was our turn, Foster did not make a speech. He had told me he would not, and he did not. He rose, and he walked to the clerk, and he laid down 3 documents one at a time, squaring each one to the edge of the counter, and he asked that they be marked, entered, and read into the record. The first was my grandfather's deed, recorded in 1961, describing 4.5 acres at the North Shore by meets and bounds, in the long dead hand of that old clerk. The second was the association's own founding plat, recorded by the developer in 1983, and Foster read the relevant passage aloud, slowly, in his flat, unhurried voice, until he reached the line where the developer himself, with his own surveyor and his own lawyer, had carved my grandfather's parcel out of the association and reserved it to the original grantor and his heirs in perpetuity. The third document was the one Diane never saw coming, because she had never once gone to the place where it lived. It was a certified correction instrument, recorded 6 full years earlier, that I had drawn and filed myself the very season I first read the chain after Carol's funeral. The season I caught the 1974 surveyor's error that had been writing the paper for 50 years. It formally restated the true boundary and confirmed the exclusion of Parcel 004, and it bore the county seal and an index number and a recording date. It had been sitting in the official public record, open to any member of the public who paid the search fee, for 6 years before Diane Keller swore to a judge that my land was hers. The judge read all 3 documents herself, top to bottom, taking her time. The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the clock. Then she took off her reading glasses, and she looked over the top of them at the association's attorney, and she asked him one question, in an even voice with no heat in it at all. She asked whether the association had reviewed the recorded chain of title for Parcel 004 at any point before initiating foreclosure and selling the property. The attorney opened his mouth and closed it. He looked down at Diane. Diane looked at the table in front of her. And in that silence, every single person in that room understood the answer was no. That in 11 years of presidency, and 19 documented incidents, and a welded gate, and a sworn lawsuit, and a drawn blind auction to her own cousin, not one person connected to the Cedar Hollow Owners Association had ever walked the 30 steps to the public counter and read the plain recorded words that had been waiting there, patient and silent, the whole time. The judge did not raise her voice either. She did not need to. She found that Parcel 004 had never been within the jurisdiction of the Cedar Hollow Owners Association, that every fine levied against it was void, that the foreclosure was a nullity, and that the auction sale to Lonnie Keller conveyed nothing because the association had never owned a thing to convey. She voided the sale from the bench. 19 documented incidents on my side. 0 fines lawfully owed. 1 deed, recorded 63 years before, that no one on the other side had ever read. I would like to tell you that was the end of it for Diane Keller. But the record has a longer reach than that, and her own filing is what extended it. Because she had sworn jurisdiction in a court document, and because the deed she tried to record named Greg's company as lienholder, The whole scheme came into the light at once. The county referred the fraudulent foreclosure documents to the district attorney. Greg Keller's Cedar Hollow Point development died on the spot because the 40 units he had drawn all faced water he was never going to own. And the financing collapsed the week the sale was voided. The development that the whole 11-year campaign existed to feed was the exact thing the campaign destroyed. She tried to take the water. She lost the project that needed it. The board removed her by a vote of the membership that fall. And the new board's first act was a written apology to me and to the Raices, hand-delivered by Thomas, who could not stop smiling. The morning after the judge voided the sale, I drove back out to the house with Maddie. The welded bar was still on the gate. Ray Whitfield met us there with a county work order of his own and a man with a grinder. And they cut it off. And the sound of that bar hitting the gravel was the best sound I had heard in 2 years. Maddie walked down to the end of the dock her great-grandfather built and her mother loved, and a stranger had tried to auction. And she sat down with her feet over the water the way she had when she was small. She did not say anything grand. She just said, "Mom would have liked today, Dad." And she was right. Carol would have liked that the water stayed ours, and that it stayed ours because I read the words. I kept the folder. It sits on the shelf in the front room where Carol kept her seed catalogs. 19 pockets, brown, with a clasp. I do not need it anymore, but I keep it the way you keep the tool that saved your life. So here is the lesson, plain as I can make it. From a man who spent 31 years behind the counter where these fights are actually won. If somebody with a clipboard and a title tells you that your land is theirs, do not argue with them on your porch. Go to the county recorder's office, which belongs to you and is open to you, and pull the chain of title on your own property. Read the legal description out loud, every word of it, and walk it against the actual ground with a tape if you have to. Find out exactly where your line runs and who reserved what to whom, because the original developer almost always wrote down more than the current board has ever bothered to read. Keep a folder. Date everything. Photograph every notice the day it lands. Pay nothing you do not owe, but pay the small, unjust thing under written protest if you must, and keep the protest. File a public records request if they hide the bylaws. Talk to your neighbors before the association turns them against you, because a board counts on you being alone. And if you ever find an error in your own chain, the way I found that old surveyor's mistake, do not sit on it. Record the correction. The record is slow, and it is quiet, and it does not care how loud anyone shouts at your gate. It only cares what was written down, and when, and by whom. Be the one who wrote it down. If you have a story like this, a fence, a gate, a notice taped where it had no business being, put it in the comments. I read them. If you want more of these, the ones where the paper wins, subscribe and stick around. Next time, I'm going to tell you about the widow 3 counties over, whose HOA tried to claim the private road her husband paved with his own money, and the toll receipt from 1991 that ended the whole thing in an afternoon. Take care of your records. They will take care of you.